From 31st October through 15th November 1995, 22 governments gathered at the International Court of Justice in The Hague to present oral submissions addressing the legal status of nuclear weapons. This issue was first brought to the court in 1993 by a majority of physicians and health experts at the World Health Assembly. They voted to request an advisory opinion on the following question. In view of the health and environmental effects, would the use of a nuclear weapon by a state in war or other armed conflict be a breach of its obligations under international law, including the WHO Constitution?
We are on the side of the victims. Our job is to protect health and protect human life from a medical point of view. And we need to speak out loud and clearly when we see that there are threats to health.
The issue for the court is the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. Weapons of indiscriminate character. Weapons of mass destruction.
In 1994, the United Nations General Assembly requested a further opinion from the court. Would the use or threat of use of a nuclear weapon in any circumstance be permitted under international law?
What should international law say about the threat or use of nuclear weapons? And what should the countries that rely on nuclear weapons do about their policies if those policies violated international law?
The court should not attempt to determine in advance whether hypothetical uses of nuclear weapons would violate international law.
The court is entitled to and should render its opinion on the questions submitted by the United Nations General Assembly.
Among all the numerous treaties which deal with weaponry, there is not one, which addresses the legality of using nuclear weapons.
4 of the declared nuclear weapon states on the United Nations Security Council were represented in the court. The US, Russia, France, and Great Britain all requested the court to refuse to answer the question.
Ne pouvant tout prévoir.
As one cannot predict everything, it is as well to ensure that one does one's best to prevent a catastrophe coming about. On account of this wording, you are, distinguished members of the court, placed in a situation in which a mathematician would find himself if he were asked to solve an equation containing an infinite number of unknown elements. Here, those unknown elements are constituted by the infinitely diverse parameters. I would say they are really infinitely diverse, that the court would be led to take into consideration if it were to undertake to answer the question.
And the only peace is to spit on a feast, your feast, yeah.
In 1973, Australia and New Zealand took France to the World Court over testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific. The case was dismissed. In 1964, a district court in Tokyo ruled that the use of nuclear weapons on Japan was not permitted under international law. However, Japan had signed away any right to compensation at the end of the Second World War. In 1984, 20,000 Dutch citizens took their government to court over deployment of nuclear missiles on Dutch territory. This case was also dismissed. The effort to test the legality of nuclear weapons continues.
Chemical weapons and biological weapons are banned. Nuclear weapons are not. For me, that is like banning cocaine while legalizing heroin. This is something that the nuclear powers have chosen to ignore for reasons of Cold War power politics hitherto. And all attempts to try to get this question put have been blocked, and there have been attempts. But now the world has changed, and they have a deep dilemma, because as long as they insist on nuclear weapons to guarantee their security, then they must expect other nations to follow their example. But they cannot allow that to happen. And so they have a choice, and it is either attempting to impose nuclear apartheid by force, like we saw in Iraq, or using the law.
Just the idea of having a legal opinion on this made Paris, London, Washington, even Moscow tremble, because they don't want this kind of a discussion. They fear that this kind of a discussion will go in the wrong direction from their own point of view. Therefore, there was tremendous resistance from these countries, especially the French and the British.
To this question, Mr. President, the French government considers that the answer is clear. General international law does not prohibit recourse to the threat or use of nuclear weapons in circumstances in which recourse to force is lawful.
And in our submission, Mr. President, there are compelling reasons why the Court should decline to respond to the request made by the General Assembly.
In 1992, Eric Geiringer, a New Zealand physician, assembled a team of doctors and international law experts to support governments at the World Health Organization. Dr. Geiringer's New Zealand Physicians Group had been approached in 1988 by Harold Evans, a retired district court judge from Christchurch, about bringing the nuclear question back to the court.
The World Court will either say that the nuclear weapons may not be used, or the World Court may say that nuclear weapons may be used. It doesn't worry us particularly. There are lots of people who think that the World Court project is a campaign to persuade the International Court of Justice to say that the law is such that nukes may not be used. This would be very nice if they did that, but that's not we're not particularly worried about that, because we know that the whole world wants nuclear weapons to be abolished. There's no doubt about it. If we had a referendum among the 5 billion people in the world, we know, and nobody will doubt it, that there would be an overwhelming majority of the peoples of the world, they don't want nukes.
Between 1992 and 1995, the World Court project gathered signatures from around the world, declarations of public conscience on the nuclear issue. The signatures represented a small proportion of the world's population, but were nevertheless accepted by the International Court of Justice as an addition to their archives. Some nuclear weapons states suggested the court had been unduly influenced by a political pressure group.
The fifth aspect, Mr. President, is citizen involvement. The Government of the United Kingdom notes in its submission on the General Assembly's request at page 1 that the requests, to quote, are the result of a sustained campaign by a group of non-governmental organizations which have long been active in promoting what they have termed the World Court Project, unquote. My government is not at all offended by the involvement of NGOs in this matter.
The State Department and the Pentagon are determined at the moment to hang on to a nuclear weapons strategy, so that when they find that the doctors and lawyers are against them, that is something which embarrasses them, whereas if it had been merely the flower people and the weirdos, it wouldn't have worried them so much.
The International Court of Justice serves a dual function. First, as an arbiter between states in conflict. The court's second and most important function is to give advice to the United Nations and other specialized agencies on any legal question.
Far from prohibiting the possession and use of nuclear weapons by all states, the Non-Proliferation Treaty effectively confirms that the 5 acknowledged nuclear weapon states are in lawful possession of such weapons, and calls for negotiations on effective measures to end the nuclear arms race and bring about nuclear disarmament at a future date.
The main nuclear states are not in disagreement with one another. There's no prospect that they're going to go to war with one another. So one feels that the role of nuclear weapons now is shifted to establishing an international order in which certain states dominate other states.
The court serves as a filter in the United Nations system, attempting to resolve conflicts which may otherwise reach the Security Council and lead to the crippling expense of peacekeeping and collective military intervention. The court seeks instead to diagnose the cause of the illness rather than treat the symptoms.
We are fighting an uphill battle at the moment because the whole world has been sucked into believing that Russia and America have got together and started a process of nuclear disarmament. So why worry? But actually what they've done is they have descended from a state of complete and utter insanity and madness, where they accumulated enough warheads by their own calculation to destroy the world 100 times over. And they got together and they said, within 10 years, with a bit of luck, and if we can do it, we will reduce this to a level where we only have enough to destroy the world 10 times over. And the whole world, bravo, the nuclear disarmament is done.
The United States is committed to this process. We and the Russian Federation are pursuing a dynamic program of substantial and wholly unprecedented reductions in numbers and types of nuclear weapons. In just the last few years, the United States and Russia have entered into a dozen new agreements that reflect our record of mutual and responsible stewardship of nuclear weapons.
I think one needs to be suspicious of all the nuclear weapon states on this issue. They all are pursuing their national interests as they see it.
The United States and Russia would then have a maximum of 3,500 strategic warheads each. The balance would be made up of the approximately 1,000 strategic warheads I've just mentioned, held by the UK, France and China, and the tactical warheads held by all nuclear weapon states.
It is true that reductions that have taken place in this area, but what remains is what counts, not what has been removed or eliminated. And what remains can still destroy the world, the entire planet, many times over.
The total expenditure in the United States today on maintenance and development of nuclear weapons still far exceeds their disarmament budget.
In these circumstances, one nuclear weapon state cannot be expected unilaterally to undertake a complete nuclear disarmament.
It's not a question of first and second in this. It'll be a winding down. And the winding down, the mechanics will have to be worked out, and the leverage that is available with threshold states that induces a nuclear weapon state to accept a concept, not talking about disarming, I'm talking about accept the concept, cannot be given away before the concept comes into place.
What we are saying is, let's get legal clarity. First of all, to put America on the spot, to show the American public that America is now in a situation where she can neither defend nukes nor attack them, and that therefore the time has probably come to have an anti-nuclear convention.
U.S. policy reflects a willingness to use nuclear weapons only in self-defense. The U.S. stands ready to impose a sufficiently high price on states engaging in acts of aggression so as to deter such acts from occurring in the first instance.
The United States may be able to deter every other country in the world from carrying out a nuclear strike on the United States. But there are countries in the world who can deter the United States from carrying out a strike too. This is the question of 5 states, really, which are the nuclear weapon states.
Well, the problem is that the genie is out of the bottle, and you cannot now disinvent the technology and the scientific knowledge that brought you the wonderful weapons in the 1940s and that others have acquired since then. You will have to live for the rest of time with the problem of knowledge being proliferated all over the world, and therefore you should ban nuclear weapons and eliminate them.
The United States is developing a strategic boost glide re-entry vehicle which would split up re-entering the Earth's atmosphere to target multiple sites. Micro, mini, and tiny nukes for regional conflicts and a generic warhead which would fit different missile types.
We do not want anybody to doubt that the Russian Federation stands for the arms control, disarmament, cessation of nuclear weapon tests, and in the long run, for the prohibition of weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. However, all these restrictions should be introduced as soon as objective conditions necessary to form a common consent of the world community ripe.
We do not mind if that target date is set at the year 2025, 30 years from now. But let us at least have a commitment to a nuclear disarmament at a date that should really seem feasible for everyone.
We have started to move in this direction. I'm quite confident that in future the world community will prohibit nuclear weapons.
One of the problems that the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union has produced is that they never thought about what would happen if they started to disarm. They didn't know it was going to be so expensive. I don't know if they thought that they were going to use the 50,000 warheads that they eventually accumulated, and that was the one way of getting rid of them. But the basic thing is that they never thought, they never planned, all of these military-industrial complex types, never planned for eliminating. And this is a tremendous problem.
Former United States Department of Defense nuclear strategist Daniel Ellsberg has indicated that there have been at least 12 specific situations in which United States presidents have seriously considered using nuclear weapons.
The inscription near the ending point at the cenotaph in Hiroshima is, "Let the souls of those who rest here rest in peace, for the errors shall not be repeated." I've been asking here in Japan, can we assure these souls that the error will not be repeated? Not at all. The mayor of Hiroshima today said, as long as these weapons exist, it is inevitable that somewhere, sometime, other Hiroshimas will happen.
The weapons are used to destroy the enemy, but nuclear weapons destroyed not the enemy themselves, but the family members of the enemy, mainly. We had perhaps about 10% of the population of Hiroshima were somehow connected with the military. But the majority of those who were destroyed here were not the enemy themselves, nor they were living in the military camp. They were living the ordinary civilian life, and these powerful devices were used against the civilian population. So they were not weapons in the conventional sense of the word.
In 1983, the World Health Organization published a report on the health and environmental effects of nuclear weapons in warfare.
No reference is made in the report to the effects to be expected from other plausible scenarios, such as a small number of accurate attacks by low-yield weapons against an equally small number of military targets in non-urban areas. The plausibility of such scenarios follows from a fact noted in the WHO report by Professor Rotblat, namely that remarkable improvements in the performance of nuclear weapons in recent years have resulted in their much greater accuracy. Clearly, such possible scenarios would not necessarily raise issues of proportionality or discrimination.
If the court has any doubt as to the indiscriminate nature of even the smallest nuclear bomb in the current world's arsenals, Zimbabwe would draw your attention to the research of Professor Rotblat in nuclear radiation in warfare.
Nuclear weapons produce radiation, which spreads all over the world. Therefore, not only the people in a particular country, in the competent countries which are involved, but everybody on the globe becomes involved in it. And also it may affect future generations. So I think this aspect makes nuclear weapons quite different from all the others.
My own health has suffered very much. As a result of the radiation poisoning, I cannot have children. I have had miscarriage on 7 occasions. On one of those occasions, I miscarried after 4 months. The child I miscarried was severely deformed. It has only one eye.
The Marshall Islands was the site of 67 nuclear weapons tests conducted by the administering authority from June 30, 1946 to August 18, 1958, during the period of the United Nations Pacific Island Territories trusteeship.
The most common defect on Rongelap and nearby Highland have been cellulitis babies. These babies are born with no bone in their bodies and with transparent skin. We can see their brain and their heart beating. The babies usually live for a days or two before they stop breathing. Many women die from abnormal pregnancies, and those who survive give birth to what looks like purple grapes, which we quickly hide away and bury.
The United States and the Netherlands, in their written statements, argued that the effects of radiation from nuclear weapons should be dismissed because radiation poisoning is merely a secondary effect.
The point about radioactivity is the unwillingness of the population to accept it. They're so scared of it. So it's not a question of how much you need to hurt them, it's a question of how much do you need to make it unacceptable to them.
So in the case of nuclear weapons, the horror associated with the damage done by these weapons draws into question their legality without any kind of specific treaty prohibition, that one doesn't, in other words, have to react in terms of additional law, that it's enough to generalize on the basis of the characteristics of the weapons themselves.
Now, would you please look at this picture? The photograph was taken on one day after the Nagasaki atomic bombing. The boy seems to be enjoying an afternoon nap on the sunlit veranda of his house. He really looks like he's having a good nap. The boy, however, is dead. He died instantly in the ferocious blast, probably not even noticing that the bomb had exploded or that he was falling into an eternal sleep. Then, can I call your attention to this picture? This photograph shows the carbonized corpse of a body. Perhaps he's 4 years old, who was exposed to the bombing near the hypocenter. What crime did these children commit? Did they take up guns and point them at the enemy?
not only the use of nuclear weapons, but the design, development, and deployment, and the symbolic use of nuclear weapons as means of deterrence constitutes already the menace to the world, as if a gun is pointed at your head without being shot.
The 1990s will see the production of more than 200 tons of plutonium in reprocessing plants and fast breeder reactors. This is more plutonium than the total amount separated in 50 years.
Disposing of nuclear waste is the major problem in nuclear energy, other than nuclear weapons. And the problem hasn't been solved. We are accumulating vast amounts of nuclear waste, either in spent reactor fuel elements or from the reprocessing of those elements in reprocessing plant, high-level liquid waste. And that has to be disposed of permanently. I mean, we're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of years. It has to be isolated from the human environment.
The 1990s have seen the beginning of a commercial fast breeder program in Japan. Fast breeder reactors reuse second-hand fuel from existing reactors and create large amounts of high-grade plutonium as a byproduct. Already enough plutonium remains unaccounted for or lost in the world to produce tens, maybe hundreds of nuclear bombs. Japan will purchase 50 tons of plutonium to kickstart its fast breeder reactor program. An admission came from a statement from the Department of Energy in Washington which said, "A successful test was conducted in 1962, which used reactor-grade plutonium in the nuclear explosive in place of weapons-grade plutonium." It went on to admit that the test confirmed that reactor-grade plutonium could be used to make a nuclear explosive.
Well, much has been said that existing nuclear installations for peaceful purposes, nuclear electrical installations, are potential nuclear weapons in the sense that if you bomb that place, you can set off an explosion, and therefore it would have the same effects as if you had dropped a bomb. So yes, there is a danger.
Really, everything in the world is dangerous. I mean, if anything that's dangerous and you want to stop it. For example, in the Iraq War, some Americans got shot by friendly fires. You want to stop wars? It's not going to happen. You cross a street, you can get killed. So we stopped crossing streets. There are certain necessities in life. Now, to meet those necessities, if nuclear energy is the answer, then you're going to have to cater for the pollution. You're going to have to reduce the risks. And you're going to have to go improve your management techniques considerably. The fact that they cannot be totally foolproof is human nature, it's human life.
The 1951 Nobel Prize for Outstanding Accomplishment in the field of chemistry is shared by two University of California scientists. They are Dr. Edwin M. Macmillan and Dr. Glenn T. Seaborg. Both are top men in the field of atomic energy and in the discovery and development of new basic elements. Between them, they found the element named plutonium for use in atomic bombs. King Gustav will present the prize in Sweden.
Well, it turns out there was a project during the war to try to, before the bomb was actually finished, but to use another aspect of the weapon, namely that we have nuclear reactors in which large quantities of radioactive materials were produced. And the idea was to make very large quantities of radioactive strontium and then fly it over and deposit it on the ground in Germany, and this way poison people. And I believe, although I was not directly involved in this at all, I only learned about this much later, that this was considered quite seriously. But at that time, it was decided not to follow it simply because not enough of this material could be produced in the reactors at that time. And in fact, in one of the letters which Oppenheimer wrote to Fermi, he said we should not go ahead unless we can produce enough radioactivity to kill 500,000 men. This is what he said. This was the idea already in 1943-44.
When nuclear terrorism comes, and nuclear terrorism is around the corner, it could come any moment in a primitive form. It will certainly come in some sophisticated form sooner or later for two reasons. Because the nuclear technology is not being packed up and controlled, because the nuclear weapon states don't want it. The development of new nukes, which seem to be particularly designed for terrorists, such as the mini nuke, so they're developing the right kind of bombs for terrorists to use. And so that terrorists will use them, because the second reason why they will use them is because there's no lack of terrorists.
If one looks carefully at patterns of violence by terrorist groups, they've rarely involved trying to kill large numbers of people. They've usually involved symbolic violence directed at the core of power, the centers of power.
The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center killed 6 people and injured 1,042. Had the bomb been covered with a radioactive substance, countless people would have died, and the financial district would have remained uninhabitable for a long time.
Well, in terms of plutonium, it happens to burn, producing particle sizes, most of which can get through the nose filter system into the lung. So it happens that plutonium, as a terrorist weapon, is a very effective one in an incendiary device. If you introduce the smoke from a fire into an air conditioning system, then everyone in that building will be at very great risk.
Plutonium has a half-life, which is the time it takes for half of the plutonium that you have to dissolve through radioactive reactions. The half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years. So that means if you have 2 kilograms today, 24,000 years from now you will have 1 kilogram still. And plutonium is one of the most poisonous, hazardous materials there is on Earth. It's so dangerous, so that, for example, only 1/27 millionth of a gram, that's very little. It's very, very little. 1/27 millionth of a gram is enough to cause lung cancer with a risk of 100%.
Those who seek to defend the legality of the use of nuclear weapons in certain circumstances fail to recognize the total consequences to which such action may lead. Apart from the humanitarian, health, and environmental considerations, experience has shown that the resources needed to clean up and repair the damage created by these weapons are enormous and have consistently been underestimated.
I mean, imagine that. You would have to demolish buildings, collect all dust. I mean, they've tried to clean up areas around Chernobyl, and they're simply exceedingly difficult. You'd have to remove the topsoil, etc., etc. It would be a massive job.
Well, in this case, I'd like to quote that when I attended the NPT Extension Conference, it was voiced by a large number of NGOs, American, that possibly the only thing that will bring their better sense to their governments is if a Chernobyl or the equivalent happens in a nuclear weapon state. And I thought that was a very telling remark. But whether that would make them change their thought process or not, I don't know. But it is definitely an indicator that it is going to take one hell of a lot to change political thinking.
This is the lesson which every child has to learn and every grown-up, and it's got to be repeated 100 times a day. It's nothing to do with what happened 1,000 years ago with bows and arrows. It's not bows and arrows, it's not gunpowder, it is not poison gas, it is not biological weapons, which are all things that we're used to, that we can handle. It is a new force that was... Take plutonium, I mean, that's the example. There wasn't any.
Plutonium is an invention. It's not found naturally like uranium. It's an invention of the 1970s when the so-called energy crisis hit the Western world and people wanted cheap nuclear energy to replace petroleum.
I will preface my address on the substantive issue before the court by stating that Qatar would like to be understood that it is placing its arguments at a level at which the use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes is preserved.
The United States especially became addicted to this plutonium, and it produced enormous quantities, so much so that it doesn't know what to do with it. And so, like in other disarmament agreements, the United States decided it wasn't going to produce any more plutonium, neither is Russia, and therefore they make a virtue out of a necessity, and they say nobody can produce plutonium. Now what happens is that you have so much of this stuff, and what they're doing is they're banning future production. That means nobody else can ever produce the stuff, and they have mounds of it.
Next multilateral step after a CTBT will be persuading those countries which have produced fissile material for weapons to cease doing so permanently and accept international supervision of their sensitive nuclear material production facilities so that there is no future increase in the supply of such material for use in nuclear arsenals.
We do know that the kind of energy that is now relied upon, if it continues to be the basis for economic development around the world, will produce a non-sustainable environment. So some adjustments have to be made in the way energy policy is affected. And of course, the nuclear technology advocates say one of the least environmentally damaging kinds of technology is that which relies on nuclear energy. And it now, I believe, is being used for 17% of the energy requirements on a global basis.
Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, access to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes has been guaranteed to developing nations. Access to means for alternative energy production, however, remains limited to those who develop the technology first. To meet their rapidly expanding energy requirements, emerging nations, especially India and China, still plan to rely heavily on nuclear technology.
What we have got is the biggest stock of thorium in the world. And it has been calculated by an endless number of people that there is only one route to meet India's growing energy demands, and that is a thorium-based fast breeder reactor program. And whereas the existing nuclear power stations are producing less than 2% of India's energy requirements, once the fast breeder reactor technology is mastered completely, I see a galloping increase in the share of nuclear power in India's total energy requirements.
From horseback to steamships to airplanes, the consequences of our actions extend ever further.
The South Pacific nuclear-free zone contributes to an overall nuclear weapon-free area which covers approximately 200 million square kilometres of the Earth's surface. Almost all of the Southern Hemisphere will be included within such zones upon the entry into force of the treaty establishing the African nuclear weapon-free zone.
So now we're living here, you and me are in a nuclear-free zone. In that nuclear-free zone, and everybody's very happy, we're in a nuclear-free zone. Under that nuclear-free zone go the nuclear-armed warships with 100 nuclear missiles that can point in every direction and do, day and night, 24 hours. A 24-hour continuous, round-the-clock threat to anybody who steps out of line. They will be nuked. The nuclear warships in our nuclear-free zone. Except, of course, that nobody has been told what the line is.
It has recently been announced that the United States will conduct 6 underground hydronuclear tests involving nuclear materials in 1996 and 1997, after they plan to conclude a CTBT. This would surely violate the spirit, if not the letter, of a comprehensive test ban treaty.
The argument that some testing of existing stocks may continue to be necessary during the transition period in order to ensure the basic physical safety of these weapons, legitimately retained for balanced deterrence purposes, is belied. Belied by the acceptance in principle by all nuclear weapon states of the conclusion as early as next year of a genuinely comprehensive test ban treaty which would allow no such tests.
This would have made sense 2,000 nuclear tests ago, but now there is no great advantage because you can, through a computer simulation, continue to do certain activities to improve your nuclear arsenal.
Of the 5 nuclear weapon states on the United Nations Security Council, 4 have shrinking economies except for China. How can such a group continue to regulate world security? And is it possible to share power with a nuclear weapons state?
The nuclear weapons power says, I have nukes. I will use them against some people, but I won't use them against you, unless I change my mind.
I would like to draw the attention of the court to the unanimous vote by the Security Council on the 11th of April 1995 of Resolution 984, which takes note with satisfaction of statements by which each of the 5 nuclear weapon states has given to states parties to the NPT which do not have such weapons positive guarantees and negative security guarantees.
As for the positive and negative assurances, they are a real joke because you have noticed that what happened was that the nuclear weapon states have refused security assurances, with the exception of China, that offers a comprehensive treaty, which is a different story. The others won't join in. But now, the ridiculous situation has arisen that the P5 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty have offered some very watered-down assurances, as you know, and in order to make them more effective, the P5 of the Security Council of the United Nations have passed a resolution saying that in case there's any nuclear aggression against a non-nuclear state, they will take action against it. Now, it happens, although nobody's supposed to know that the P5 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are the same states as the P5 of the Security Council. In other words, what they have now promised the world is this, that if any one of us makes nuclear aggression against any one of you, so if we will attack you, we will defend you. Unless, of course, they've all 5 got a veto. So what you have is a situation where they say, if we attack you, we will defend you, unless one of us objects.
The United States alone is responsible for 1/4 of the United Nations budget. The current outstanding debt of U.S. payment to the UN is more than their annual contribution and more than the outstanding contributions of the rest of the world combined. The U.S. earns more in New York State alone from the United Nations than the annual U.S. contribution. However, the U.S. military contribution to United Nations-approved collective intervention over the years remains impossible to calculate.
Whilst America can dominate the United Nations, America cannot dominate world opinion. And America is traditionally extremely sensitive to world opinion. Now, what you do when you go to the World Court is you bring the question of the legality of nuclear weapons before the whole of the world.
Some states in their submissions to the court have gone so far as to suggest that any use of nuclear weapons which results in the death of a large number of civilians would constitute genocide. It has been claimed that the intent to engage in genocidal acts could be inferred from the failure of the party using nuclear weapons to appreciate fully the destructive consequences of such use. In light of the atrocities and malevolence that the history of this century associates with genocide, the United States regrets that assertions of genocidal conduct have been so imprecisely made in this context.
No resolution requesting an opinion from the court was even put forward in the Assembly until after the WHO had made its request in May 1993. The test ban negotiations are making sound progress, and the conclusion of a treaty within a matter of months is highly probable. Many states involved are committed to this outcome, and while the negotiations for a cut-off treaty have failed to start, the reasons for this have nothing to do with the absence of an advisory opinion or with the uncertainty over the question of legality.
This morning, the United Kingdom and the United States of America have said that an opinion of the court on the substance of the questions put might have negative effects, which would have an impact on the evolution of the negotiations on nuclear disarmament. My question is, on what concrete facts do these delegations base themselves in order to justify this statement? Thank you.
We are convinced that the opinion of this court would not have any negative impact on the set of negotiations on the disarmament process which are taking place.
Well, I think more than any of the other diplomatic initiatives, such as the elimination of testing or the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, this one is clear-cut because it's really saying these weapons as such are illegal and that there are no exceptions and that it is not a permissible option for governments to pursue their security by relying on these weapons.
Well, the impact, of course, I believe is going to be big. It's only an advisory opinion, we know. It's not binding. But I believe that in terms of world public opinion, things are going to change overnight, the day that the World Court announces the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons are illegal.
I believe the World Court Project was correct to try to stimulate world interest and commitment on the issue of the legality of nuclear weapons. But it has to be understood that it's a fairly modest effort.
You've got to take the whole of history and wipe the way of thinking about war and peace and nations and so on that we had up to 1945. That was all very well. It made some kind of sense. It does not make sense anymore. That's what Einstein says. We shall require a substantially new manner of thinking. He wasn't just stringing pretty words together. He meant that literally.
I believe that if I was in charge of the Royal Navy, the following day I would have to consider seriously going to the Prime Minister and saying that the Polaris submarine on patrol would have to come back into port and the missiles would have to be offloaded into store, because I could not ask my men to go out and threaten to use them with this new legal norm having been advised.
If these weapons could not lawfully be used in individual or collective self-defense under any circumstances, there would be no credible threat of such use in response to aggression, and deterrent policies would be futile and meaningless.
So I see this as a positive development no matter what happens. Of course, it would be more dramatic positive development if the court decides, yes, these weapons are already illegal and their threat or use would inevitably violate international law. Then it puts the public opinion in the position of seeking to influence the governments to respect this advisory opinion.
If there is a perceptible move in the rest of the world for scaling down the level of nuclear capabilities, Indian response would be to that situation. But if the idea that the Americans and the other countries want to upgrade the system till well into the middle of the next century, India would have no other option but to think of the entire spectrum of the weapons and the capability in the hands of other powers and respond to it.
It's really a pity that we have to talk about weapons all the time, because they are the forefront and the danger and the trouble about all this technology, because talking about weapons makes people concentrate on friends, enemies, battles, destruction and so on, when actually not only the benefit but the dangers of nuclear technology are much greater and fundamental.
Like Siamese twins, the use of nuclear technology for peaceful purposes and the production of nuclear weapons are virtually inseparable. The European Union has recently supported the concept of establishing an international alternative energy agency. However, would such an agency be dominated by the existing transnational nuclear industry?
The problem at the moment is that governments are not prepared, for political reasons, to put the research money in. They're not prepared, for political reasons, to firmly oppose the arguments in favor of nuclear power, for example. So they won't they won't finance the development of other sources of energy.
If the future of mankind is to be guaranteed, the use of nuclear weapons and the threat to use them should be considered unlawful in all circumstances, since they pose a severe threat to life on Earth.
To get people somehow to understand that when this little boy from New Zealand, from Nelson, Rutherford, went abroad and split the atom, something happened which changed all human history. What's going on is a new force has been released, which did not exist on Earth before, not in this form. In the nearest to Earth that it exists in is millions of miles away in the sun. And there it is safely there, and has been filtered out for as long as the Earth and the sun have existed. And now we've brought it down to Earth, and we're not willing to take the logical conclusion and say, this requires an entirely new way of managing things. And if we don't do it, we are going to mess up our own species, life on Earth, and all the wonderful hopes that we have. We have got to tackle, we've got to face up to what it means that we manage to split the atom.
It would be of no benefit to the peace and security we all wish to achieve, to the court's credibility, or to the development of the international legal order, for the court to accept the invitation presented by advocates of a legal prohibition to recognize phantom legal norms. Accordingly, we respectfully urge this honorable court to decline the requests before it to issue an advisory opinion. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, members of the court.
The answer to the WHO's question is yes. And the answer to the General Assembly's question, weapons will be permitted under international law.